September 1944, Chartres, France. A supply depot 60 miles southwest of Paris. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Threlkeld stood in a warehouse watching his men unload another convoy of trucks from the Red Ball Express. Every third crate showed damage, cracked wood, split packaging, contents spilling onto the concrete floor, ammunition boxes with crushed corners, medical supplies with broken vials, ration crates with torn metal strapping and scattered contents. The losses were staggering, and they were getting worse. The numbers told a brutal story. Of every 100 tons shipped from Normandy beaches to forward depots, only 65 tons arrived intact and usable. 35% losses, not from German action, from the supply chain itself. Broken axles on rough roads explained some of it. Pilferage accounted for more. But the largest single category was simple damage during transport. Crates breaking apart, contents shifting and crushing each other, inadequate securing methods failing on the cratered French roads. The Red Ball Express was moving 8,000 tons per day, which meant nearly 3,000 tons per day were arriving damaged or disappearing entirely. Threlkeld had tried everything: better crates, more strapping, detailed loading diagrams. Nothing worked. The trucks still rolled in with shattered cargo and missing supplies. And now, standing in his depot office, he faced a proposal so absurd he'd initially dismissed it out of hand. The man across from him was Technical Sergeant Vernon Hayes, a 34-year-old truck driver from the 676th Quartermaster Truck Company. Before the war, Hayes had driven long-haul freight for a shipping company in Baltimore. He'd been doing this work for 16 years. He knew trucks, he knew cargo, and he'd spent the last 3 weeks developing what he called a complete revision of loading protocol. Threlkeld had read the proposal twice. It seemed to suggest doing everything backwards. Loading lighter items on bottom, securing individual items rather than whole pallets, using 3 times as much rope and strapping, building what Hayes called compression modules that would somehow protect cargo better than standard military packing. The whole thing looked like it would triple loading time and waste massive amounts of securing materials. Sergeant Hayes, Threlkeld said, your method would require substantially more rope, more strapping, and significantly longer loading times. We're already struggling to meet tonnage requirements. How exactly does slowing everything down and using more materials help us? Hayes had heard this question before. Sir, with respect, we're measuring the wrong thing. We're counting tons loaded. We should be counting tons delivered intact. Right now, we're loading fast and losing a third of it. My method loads slower but delivers 90% intact. The math works. 90%, Threlkeld repeated. You're claiming 10% losses instead of 35. Yes, sir. I've been testing it on my own truck for 3 weeks. Documented every load. The data's in the proposal. Threlkeld looked at the paperwork again. Hayes had indeed kept detailed records. But one truck, even over 3 weeks, wasn't proof of concept. The Red Ball Express operated nearly 6,000 trucks. What worked for Hayes might not scale. And yet, if the man was even half right, the implications were staggering. A reduction from 35% to 10% losses would effectively increase supply delivery by 40% without adding a single additional truck. All right, Sergeant, Threlkeld said. You get 1 convoy, 20 trucks. You'll supervise loading personally using your method. We'll document losses on delivery. If your numbers hold, we'll talk about expansion. Hayes nodded. Thank you, sir. You won't regret this. Threlkeld wasn't sure about that. But he knew the current situation was unsustainable. Sometimes you had to try ridiculous ideas. This is the story of how a Baltimore trucker's unconventional loading technique revolutionized military logistics. saved thousands of tons of supplies, and changed how the Army thought about the unglamorous but critical work of getting materials to the front. Understanding what Vernon Hayes accomplished requires understanding the magnitude of the supply crisis facing Allied forces in France during autumn 1944. The numbers were staggering in a way that's difficult to fully grasp. The advance from Normandy to the German border consumed supplies at a rate no military force in history had ever attempted to sustain. A single American infantry division in active combat required approximately 650 tons of supplies per day. An armored division needed twice that. By September 1944, Lieutenant General Omar Bradley's 12th Army Group fielded 16 divisions actively engaged across a front stretching from the Belgian border to eastern France. The daily requirement exceeded 12,000 tons. Every single day, without fail. The supply chain to deliver those materials was breaking down. The fundamental problem was distance. The Normandy invasion had succeeded brilliantly in establishing a beachhead, but Allied forces had advanced so rapidly that they'd outrun their supply lines. The massive artificial harbors, the Mulberry docks at Arromanches and Omaha Beach, could handle the tonnage. Shore parties could unload the ships. The supplies existed, but getting them from the Normandy coast to forward positions now hundreds of miles inland was proving nearly impossible. Railways would have been ideal. A single freight train could move what required dozens of trucks. But French railways had been systematically destroyed, first by Allied bombing before D-Day to prevent German reinforcement, then by retreating German forces who demolished tracks, bridges, and rolling stock as they withdrew. The French rail network wouldn't be operational at scale for months. Everything had to move by truck. The Red Ball Express had been established in August to address exactly this challenge. The name came from railroad terminology. A Red Ball was a high-priority fast freight. The concept was elegant in its simplicity. Designate specific routes as one-way truck highways. Northbound routes carried loaded trucks toward the front. Southbound routes returned empty trucks to the coast. Keep them moving 24 hours a day. Maximize tonnage delivery. On paper, it was brilliant. In practice, it was chaos. The roads themselves were the first problem. French rural routes had been built for peacetime farm traffic, not endless convoys of 2.5-ton trucks loaded to capacity. The surface conditions ranged from poor to catastrophic. Potholes the size of bathtubs. Sections of road cratered by artillery during the breakthrough. Stretches where Allied bombing had destroyed bridges and engineers had built temporary bypasses through fields. Trucks broke down constantly. Blown tires, cracked axles, burnt-out clutches, overheated engines. Mechanical failure rates hit 20% on some convoys. The Red Ball Express had dedicated maintenance units stationed at intervals along the routes, but repairs took time and removed trucks from service. Every truck in the shop was tonnage not delivered. Driver fatigue was another factor. The Red Ball operated continuously, which meant drivers worked punishing schedules. A typical run from Normandy to a forward depot near the front was 300 miles. On good roads in peacetime, maybe 6 hours. On Red Ball routes in combat conditions, 12 to 16 hours was standard. Then drivers were expected to reload and drive back. Exhausted drivers made mistakes. Mistakes caused accidents. Accidents damaged trucks and destroyed cargo. But the single largest source of losses was cargo damage during transport. This was the problem nobody seemed able to solve. Standard military loading procedure had been developed for different conditions. It assumed reasonable roads, moderate speeds, and relatively short distances. Load pallets of similar items together. Strap them down. Stack to maximize space utilization. The goal was fitting maximum tonnage per truck. This approach failed catastrophically on Red Ball routes. A truck hitting a pothole at 20 miles per hour generated enormous forces. Cargo shifted. Strapping that seemed secure at the loading dock failed after 50 miles of rough roads. Pallets came loose and slammed into other pallets. Heavy items crushed lighter items. Improperly balanced loads caused cargo to shift laterally, affecting truck handling and sometimes causing vehicles to overturn. Ammunition was particularly problematic. Artillery shells were heavy and came in wooden crates that weren't designed for this kind of abuse. A crate of 105 mm howitzer shells weighed approximately 90 pounds. Stack them 4 high on a pallet, and you have 360 pounds. If that pallet breaks free during transport and collides with another pallet of shells, the wooden crates split apart. Shells roll loose. By the time the truck reaches its destination, you have damaged crates, dented shells that might not chamber properly, and a dangerous mess that takes hours to sort out. Medical supplies faced different challenges but equally severe consequences. Glass vials of morphine or blood plasma didn't survive rough transport well. Pack them inadequately and you arrived with boxes of broken glass and useless supplies. Medics at forward aid stations desperately needed those materials. Telling them a shipment was 50% broken on arrival wasn't acceptable. Rations seemed simple. How much damage could canned food sustain? More than you'd think. The standard K ration came in a waxed cardboard box. Those boxes weren't durable. They weren't meant to be thrown around. Pack them badly, subject them to shifting cargo and rough roads, and the boxes collapsed. Cans split open. Food spoiled. Soldiers at the front already dealt with enough misery. Damaged rations added insult to injury. Fuel was its own category of nightmare. Gasoline came in 5-gallon jerrycans, a brilliant German design the Allies had copied. The cans were durable and efficient, but they were also heavy, 40 pounds when full, and the fumes were explosive. A truck loaded with jerrycans carrying 800 gallons of fuel was a rolling bomb. If those cans weren't secured properly and one ruptured during transport, you had gasoline sloshing around a truck bed. One spark from metal scraping metal, and the entire load could ignite. The loss statistics Threlkeld faced were compiled from hundreds of delivery reports. They showed the problem in brutal detail. Of supplies loaded at Normandy depots, 35% arrived at forward positions either damaged, missing, or completely destroyed. Break that down by category, and certain patterns emerged. Ammunition, 42% losses due to damaged crates and loose ordnance. Medical supplies, 38% losses, primarily broken glass and crushed packaging. Rations, 28% losses from collapsed boxes and punctured containers. Fuel, 18% losses from ruptured jerrycans and spillage. General equipment and spare parts, 32% losses from inadequate securing and cargo shifting. These weren't theoretical numbers. They translated directly to operational capability. An infantry company that should have received 5,000 rounds of 30-06 ammunition might receive 3,000 usable rounds, because the rest arrived in damaged containers or with dented casings. A battalion aid station expecting 200 doses of morphine might receive 120 intact vials. An armored company waiting for replacement tank tracks might find the shipment arrived with cracked links from improper transport. The cumulative effect was devastating. The advance toward Germany was slowing not because of German resistance, though that remained fierce, but because forward units were literally running out of supplies. Patton's Third Army had been forced to halt offensive operations in early September because fuel deliveries couldn't keep pace with consumption. The same supply crisis affected every Allied formation. Multiple solutions had been attempted. Better crates were specified, but lumber quality was inconsistent, and better crates took longer to build. More strapping was added to loads, but strapping failed when cargo shifted violently. Loading diagrams were created showing optimal weight distribution, but they assumed cargo would stay where it was placed. Nothing addressed the fundamental problem. Standard loading methods couldn't handle red ball conditions. Staff officers at comms Communication Zone headquarters, responsible for logistics, had formed working groups to study the problem. They'd produced reports. They'd issued new directives. They'd experimented with different strapping patterns and pallet configurations. Nothing worked. Losses remained stubbornly around 35%. The prevailing assumption was that losses at this level were inevitable. You couldn't move this much tonnage this fast over these roads without significant damage. The solution was increasing tonnage shipped to compensate for expected losses. If you needed 100 tons delivered, ship 150 tons and accept that a third would be lost. Inefficient, yes, but apparently unavoidable. Vernon Hayes thought differently. He'd spent 3 weeks proving it on his own truck. Now he had one convoy, 20 trucks, to prove it at scale. If his method worked, he could change everything. If it failed, the Red Ball Express would continue hemorrhaging supplies all the way to the German border. Loading for the test convoy began at 0400 hours the next morning. Hayes had assembled a team of drivers he trusted from the 676th Quartermaster Truck Company. Most were, like him, experienced civilian truckers before the war. They understood cargo. They knew what happened when loading went wrong. And they'd all watched standard military loading procedures produce disaster after disaster. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. These are the stories that don't make it into textbooks, the unglamorous innovations that won wars. Hayes stood in the warehouse at 0415 explaining his method to 19 skeptical drivers. His own truck was already loaded using the technique he developed. It would serve as the demonstration model. Everything you learned about military loading procedures, Hayes said, forget it. We're starting from scratch. The standard approach, he explained, treated cargo as a volume problem. How much tonnage can you fit in the truck bed? The answer determined success. Pack it tight, strap it down, go. Hayes's method treated cargo as a dynamics problem. How does cargo behave during transport? The answer determined everything else. When this truck hits a pothole, Hayes said, slapping his hand against the side of his vehicle, everything in the bed experiences sudden acceleration. Down, then up. If cargo's stacked loose, it lifts off the bed floor, then slams back down. That's when strapping fails. That's when crates break. That's when you get shifting and collisions. His solution was something he called compression modules. The concept was counterintuitive. Instead of strapping cargo down to prevent movement, you packed cargo so tightly together that it couldn't move even without strapping. Then you added strapping not to hold individual items down, but to hold the entire compressed module together as a single unit. He walked the drivers to his truck and dropped the tailgate. The truck bed was packed completely full. But the organization looked nothing like standard military loading. The bottom layer consisted of the heaviest, most durable items. In this case, wooden crates of tools and spare parts. But instead of placing them flat and stable, which was standard procedure, Hayes had them positioned to create a solid foundation that would distribute weight evenly. Heavy items on the bottom made sense in normal thinking. What differed was how deliberately he'd arranged them to support what came above. The next layer was medium-weight items, ration boxes, ammunition crates, medical supply containers, but they weren't stacked by type. Hayes had mixed them deliberately, placing a box of rations next to a crate of bandages, next to a box of rifle ammunition. Different shapes, he explained. They nest together, fill gaps, create friction. Between each item in this layer, Hayes had placed wadding material, crumpled burlap sacks, bundled canvas strapping, even wadded paper when nothing else was available. Every gap is a space for cargo to shift into, he said. Fill the gaps, eliminate the shifting. The top layer was the lightest items. This was the most counterintuitive aspect. Standard loading put heavy items on bottom to prevent crushing lighter items. Hayes agreed with that principle but took it further. The top layer in his system was packed so tightly with light items, individual ration boxes, first aid pouches, small equipment, that it created a lid. This layer, he said, is under compression from the tarp when we tie it down. It presses down on everything below, creates unified pressure across the whole load. The drivers looked doubtful. "Sergeant," one of them said, "this looks like it'd take hours to load. We're supposed to load fast." "Private Castellano," Hayes replied, "how long does it take to load a truck the standard way?" 30 minutes, maybe 45 if we're careful." "Right. And how much of that load arrives intact?" Castellano grimaced. "Maybe 2/3. Sometimes worse. My method takes 90 minutes to load, but 90% arrives intact. So we spend an extra hour loading and deliver an extra 25% of cargo. Which math works better?" Another driver spoke up. "What about tonnage? Looks like all that wadding and careful placement means you're carrying less actual supplies." Hayes nodded. "Good question. Yes, I'm carrying about 15% less tonnage than maximum capacity, but I'm delivering 75% more intact cargo than standard loading. Again, which math works better?" The strapping system was the final element. Hayes used 3 times as much rope and canvas strapping as standard procedures required. But he didn't strap individual pallets. He ran strapping in a grid pattern across the entire load, creating what he described as a web. "Every strap is under tension," he said. "They support each other. One strap alone might fail. The whole web won't." He'd also added an innovation he called anchor points. Standard practice ran straps over the load and hooked them to the truck bed sides. Those hooks could pull free under stress. Hayes's method involved driving metal stakes into pre-drilled holes in the truck bed floor, running straps around the stakes, then over the load, then around stakes on the opposite side. "The anchors can't pull out," he explained. "The whole bed would have to tear apart first." The final step was the tarp. Every truck bed was covered with a canvas tarp to protect cargo from weather. Standard procedure laid the tarp over the load and tied it at the corners. Hayes's method wrapped the tarp tight, creating additional compression, and secured it with a rope edge lacing that essentially sewed the tarp to the load. "The tarp isn't just weather protection," he said. "It's part of the compression system." When Hayes finished explaining, the warehouse was silent. The method was complex. It required more time, more materials, and more attention to detail than anything the drivers were used to. It contradicted standard procedures in multiple ways. "All right," Hayes said, "let's load these trucks." The next 6 hours were controlled chaos. Hayes supervised every truck personally, demonstrating the compression module technique on each load. The drivers learned by doing, making mistakes, correcting them under Hayes's direction. Loading the first truck took 2 hours. The second took 90 minutes. By the 5th truck, the crews were getting faster, but it was still dramatically slower than standard loading. Warehouse staff watching the process looked increasingly skeptical. This was supposed to be an improvement. Lieutenant Colonel Threlkeld appeared at 0900 to check progress. He watched Hayes and his crew working on truck number 8, carefully placing each item, filling every gap, building the compression modules layer by layer. "Sergeant Hayes," Threlkeld said, "you're averaging 90 minutes per truck. At that rate, loading a full convoy of 100 trucks would take, 150 hours? Sir, these crews are learning the method from scratch. Give them a week of practice, they'll be down to 60 minutes per truck. Give them a month, they'll hit 45. And we won't need to load trucks one at a time. Once crews know the system, you can load in parallel." Threlkeld didn't look convinced, but he let the test continue. By 1400 hours, all 20 trucks were loaded. Hayes walked the line, inspecting each vehicle personally. He checked strapping tension. He verified compression on the top layers. He examined the anchor points. Truck 17 needed its entire load redone. Someone had left gaps in the second layer. Hayes made them unload and reload properly. Truck 9's strapping wasn't tight enough. They redid the web. At 1600 hours, the convoy was ready. Hayes gathered the drivers for final instructions. "Route is standard red ball northbound," he said. "Convoy speed is 20 miles per hour maximum. No exceptions. Anyone breaks down, the whole convoy stops while we transfer their load. We arrive together, and we arrive with intact cargo." "Why 20 miles per hour?" Castellano asked. "Convoys usually run 25. "Because," Hayes said, "those extra 5 miles per hour double the force when you hit a pothole. Speed creates violence. Violence damages cargo. We're not racing. We're delivering." The convoy rolled out at 1630 hours. Destination was a forward supply depot at Verdun, approximately 180 miles northeast. Estimated travel time was 12 hours, accounting for the reduced speed and inevitable delays. They'd arrive at dawn. Threlkeld had assigned a documentation team to the convoy. 2 clerks with clipboards rode in a jeep, recording everything. They'd note any cargo shifting, any strapping failures, any problems during transport. On arrival, they'd conduct a complete inventory comparing loaded cargo to delivered cargo. The test would be thoroughly documented. Hayes rode in the lead truck. Behind him, 19 vehicles loaded with compressed, wadded, strapped, and tarped cargo that had taken 6 times longer to load than standard procedure. If this worked, if the math actually held, everything would change. If it failed, he'd just wasted a day and made himself look like a fool. The convoy disappeared into the French countryside as the sun set. In 12 hours, they'd have the answer. The convoy's route followed Red Ball northbound Highway No. 2, a designation that sounded more impressive than the reality. The highway was a patchwork of French departmental roads, farm tracks, and improvised bypasses around destroyed bridges. In peacetime, maybe a dozen vehicles per day used these routes. Now they carried thousands of trucks in endless procession. Hayes sat in the passenger seat of the lead vehicle, driven by Corporal Anthony Moretti, a former furniture delivery driver from Philadelphia. Moretti knew his vehicle intimately, every quirk of the transmission, every tendency of the steering, the exact sound the engine made when it was happy versus when it was struggling. "Sergeant," Moretti said as they passed through a small village, "I've driven this route 11 times. Never felt a load this stable." "How's she handling?" Hayes asked. "Like the cargo's welded in place. No shifting. No lateral pull. She's tracking straight. That was a good sign. Cargo shifting affected vehicle handling, especially in turns. A load that moved laterally could push the truck toward the outside of a curve, making handling unpredictable. Drivers compensated instinctively, but it was dangerous. Hayes's compression method was designed to prevent exactly that problem. 20 minutes outside the depot, they hit their first serious test, a stretch of road that had been shelled during the breakthrough in August. Engineers had filled the craters with gravel and crushed stone, but the surface was brutal. Potholes every few yards, some a foot deep. "Here we go," Morty muttered, downshifting to keep their speed at 15 miles per hour. The truck hit the first pothole with a jarring impact that Hayes felt through the seat. In his previous experience with standard loaded trucks, this was where you'd hear the first signs of trouble. Cargo shifting, strapping creaking. Maybe a crash as something came loose. Nothing. The load stayed silent. They hit 3 more potholes in quick succession. The truck bounced. The suspension compressed and rebounded. The frame flexed. But from the cargo bed, silence. Whatever was happening back there, the compression modules were holding. Behind them, the rest of the convoy navigated the same obstacle course. Hayes watched in the side mirror. Every truck maintained spacing. Nobody stopped. No visible problems. They cleared the bad section and returned to merely rough road. Moretti allowed speed to increase back to 20 miles per hour. The convoy passed other red ball traffic moving south. Empty trucks returning to the coast for another load. Hayes watched them carefully. Many showed signs of hard use. Dented fenders, cracked windshields, jury-rigged repairs to mechanical damage. The red ball was brutal on equipment. 2 hours into the journey, they encountered the inevitable breakdown. Not one of theirs, a southbound truck from a different company, had thrown a rod and died in the middle of the road. The driver and his assistant were trying to push it to the shoulder. Hayes's convoy stopped. Military courtesy demanded helping stranded drivers. Hayes and several others jumped out to assist. Together they manhandled the dead truck off the road. "What are you hauling?" the stranded driver asked, looking at Hayes's convoy. "Standard mixed load," Hayes replied. "Ammo, rations, medical supplies, equipment. Long way from the coast. You'll lose a third of it by the time you arrive." "Maybe not," Hayes said. The driver laughed. "Brother, I've made this run 40 times. You always lose a third. That's just how it is." They got back underway. The encounter stuck with Hayes. The resignation in the other driver's voice. That's just how it is. Acceptance of massive inefficiency because nobody believed it could be different. If his method worked, that attitude would have to change. At 2200 hours, they stopped at a Red Ball service area for refueling and rest. The area was a former German Wehrmacht garage that engineers had converted to an Allied maintenance depot. Fuel trucks, repair equipment, exhausted drivers grabbing coffee and rest. Hayes walked the convoy line while trucks refueled. He climbed into each truck bed, checking loads by flashlight. What he saw was remarkable. Truck after truck showed the same pattern. The compression modules had held perfectly. No shifting. No gaps had opened. The strapping remained under tension. The cargo looked almost exactly as it had when they'd loaded it 6 hours earlier. He found the documentation clerks drinking coffee near their Jeep. "Anything to report?" Hayes asked. The senior clerk, a technical sergeant named Silverstein, shook his head. "Most boring convoy I've ever been on. No incidents. No cargo problems. Nothing to document except miles traveled." "That's perfect," Hayes said. "Sergeant Hayes," Silverstein said carefully, "I've been documenting Red Ball convoys for 3 months. I've never seen loads this stable. Whatever you're doing, it's working." They rolled out again at 2300 hours. 6 more hours to Verdun. The overnight portion of the journey tested a different aspect of the method. Temperature dropped. Moisture condensed on the tarps. The roads, already poor, became more treacherous with dew. Visibility decreased. Drivers relied on instinct and the faint taillights of the truck ahead. Hayes dozed fitfully, jerking awake every time they hit a bad pothole or made a sharp turn. Each time, he listened for sounds of cargo trouble. Each time, nothing. The loads were holding. At 0300 hours, they passed through Rheims. The city was dark except for military checkpoints. MPs waved them through without stopping. Red Ball convoys had priority over everything except ambulances. Dawn broke at 0600 hours. They were 30 miles from Verdun, making good time despite the reduced speed. The documentation clerks pulled alongside Hayes's truck at a straight section of road. "Sergeant," Silverstein called out, "we're coming up on 12 hours. You planning to stop for rest?" "Negative," Hayes called back. "We finish this run." If you're finding this level of detail valuable, subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with your thoughts on logistics innovations that changed the war. These unglamorous solutions often mattered more than dramatic battles. They rolled into Verdun Depot at 0745, 14 hours after departure. The receiving officer, a captain named Tischendorf, met them at the gate with a clipboard and a skeptical expression. "You're the test convoy," Tischendorf said to Hayes. "We've been told to conduct a thorough receiving inspection. This is going to take a while." "Take all the time you need, sir," Hayes replied. "We're not going anywhere." What followed was the most detailed cargo inspection Hayes had ever witnessed. Tischendorf had assembled a team of inventory specialists. They unloaded each truck completely, inspecting every item, comparing it to the loading manifest, documenting every piece of damage or loss. The process took 8 hours. Hayes tried to stay busy, but mostly he waited, drinking bad coffee and trying not to watch too obviously. At 1600 hours, Tischendorf emerged from the warehouse with his clipboard and the final tally. His expression was unreadable. "Sergeant Hayes," he said formally, "inspection is complete." "Yes, sir." 20 trucks. Mixed cargo. Ammunition, rations, medical supplies, equipment, fuel. Total tonnage loaded, 212 tons. Total tonnage delivered. He paused, checking his numbers again. 201 tons intact and usable. 11 tons showing minor damage but still functional. 0 tons completely lost or destroyed. Hayes did the math in his head. Minor damage was acceptable. Scuffed crates that didn't affect contents. The real number was usable delivery. 201 tons out of 212. 95%. Even better than his prediction. For comparison, Tischendorf continued, "Last week we received a convoy of similar size using standard loading procedures. Of 220 tons shipped, 142 tons arrived intact. 65%. Your convoy delivered 95%. The captain looked up from his clipboard. "Sergeant, whatever you're doing, it works. I'm recommending immediate adoption of your method across all Red Ball operations." Hayes felt the tension drain from his shoulders. The test had succeeded beyond his best-case scenario. "Thank you, sir," he said. "But with respect, one convoy isn't proof. We need to test this at scale. Multiple convoys, different crews, different cargo mixes. Make sure it wasn't just luck." Tischendorf smiled slightly. "Sergeant, I've been receiving Red Ball shipments for 4 months. I know what luck looks like. This wasn't luck. This was skill." Word of Hayes' success reached Comm's headquarters within 24 hours. The response was immediate and intense. Lieutenant General John C.H. Lee, commanding general of comms, was a logistics officer to his core. He understood instantly what a reduction from 35% losses to 5% losses would mean. It would mean effectively adding 50% more delivery capacity to the Red Ball Express without adding a single truck. It would mean forward units receiving supplies they desperately needed. It would mean the advance toward Germany could continue. Lee ordered an immediate expansion of the test. Hayes was to train crews from 5 different quartermaster companies. They would load and run 50 convoys over 2 weeks. The results would be documented and analyzed. If the numbers held, the method would become standard procedure across all Red Ball operations. Hayes was promoted to warrant officer and given temporary duty assignment to Comm's headquarters with one mission: make this work at scale. The challenges became apparent immediately. Hayes had developed his method through personal trial and error over 3 weeks. He could execute it perfectly on his own truck. He'd successfully taught 19 other drivers during the test convoy. But now he needed to teach hundreds of drivers, loaders, and supervisors. The method had to be standardized, documented, and made teachable. Hayes spent 3 days in October 1944 writing the manual that would become Technical Manual 347, Compression Module Loading Procedures for Quartermaster Truck Companies. It was 32 pages of detailed instructions, diagrams, and specifications. The manual broke the method into specific steps that any crew could follow. Step 1, inspect truck bed and install anchor stakes in pre-drilled positions. Step 2, create base layer using heaviest items positioned for weight distribution and foundation support. Step 3, build second layer with medium weight items mixed by type to maximize nesting and friction. Step 4, fill all gaps in second layer with wadding material. Step 5, create top layer with lightest items packed under compression. Step 6, install strapping in specified web pattern, tension to standard. Step 7, apply and secure tarp using edge lacing technique. Each step included detailed diagrams showing exactly how items should be positioned, how gaps should be filled, and how strapping should be routed. The manual also specified tools and materials required. Every loading crew needed metal stakes, 6 per truck, with mounting hardware, canvas strapping, 150 feet per truck, manila rope, 200 feet per truck, wadding material, burlap sacks, canvas scraps, or paper, edge lacing rope for tarp, securing tension measurement tools for strapping comms, authorized immediate production and distribution of these materials to all quartermaster truck companies. Depot supply officers scrambled to meet the requirements. Training began in mid-October. Hayes and a cadre of drivers from the successful test convoy became instructors. They visited quartermaster companies up and down the Red Ball, demonstrating the compression module method, supervising practice loading sessions, certifying crews as qualified. The resistance was immediate and substantial. Senior NCOs who'd been loading trucks for 20 years didn't appreciate a warrant officer telling them they'd been doing it wrong. "I've loaded 10,000 trucks," one grizzled master sergeant told Hayes. "Never needed compression modules or special strapping. Never needed 90 minutes per truck. You're overcomplicating this." Hayes had learned to handle this objection. "Sergeant, how many of those 10,000 trucks were running Red Ball routes?" "Maybe 200. "And what were your loss rates?" The sergeant grimaced. 40%. "But that's normal for these roads." "It was normal," Hayes said. "It doesn't have to be." He'd brought data. Charts showing loss rates from standard loading versus compression module loading. The numbers were undeniable. After seeing the evidence, most NCOs grudgingly agreed to try the new method. Younger soldiers adapted more quickly. Private soldiers who'd been loading trucks for only a few months had no deeply ingrained habits to break. They learned the compression module technique easily and often became the best practitioners. The real challenge was cultural. The Army ran on speed and efficiency. Loading trucks quickly was valued. Taking extra time for careful loading felt wrong to people trained in military urgency. Hayes had to repeatedly emphasize that delivering supplies intact was more important than loading them fast. "Would you rather load 100 trucks in 30 hours and deliver 65 tons per truck?" he'd ask, "or load 100 trucks in 60 hours and deliver 95 tons per truck?" The math always won the argument, but cultural change took time. By November, 50 convoys using compression module loading had been documented. The average delivery rate was 92% intact cargo. Some convoys hit 95%. The worst was 87%, still dramatically better than the 35% loss rate of standard loading. The data was conclusive. On November 12, 1944, COMS issued General Order Number 73, making compression module loading mandatory for all quartermaster truck companies operating on Red Ball routes. The order was effective immediately. Every truck company received copies of Technical Manual 347. Depot supply officers distributed anchor stakes, strapping, and wadding materials. Training cadres visited every company to certify crews. Within 2 weeks, The entire Red Ball Express had converted to the new method. The impact was measurable in multiple ways. First, delivery rates. By late November, Red Ball convoys were consistently delivering 88 to 93% of cargo intact. The losses had dropped from 35% to approximately 10%. This represented an effective increase in delivery capacity of nearly 40%. Second, forward supply levels. Units at the front began receiving adequate supplies for the first time since the rapid advance from Normandy. Ammunition stocks increased, rations improved, medical supplies arrived intact, maintenance parts became available. Third, operational tempo. The pause in offensive operations that had characterized September and early October ended. With supplies flowing reliably, Allied forces resumed their advance toward the German border. Third Army, which had been stalled by fuel shortages, received enough gasoline to continue operations. Fourth, morale. Soldiers at the front noticed that supplies were arriving in better condition. Fewer damaged rations. More intact ammunition. Medical supplies that actually worked. These improvements seemed small individually, but cumulatively made a significant difference in how soldiers viewed the supply system. The method also had unexpected benefits. The slower, more careful loading process resulted in fewer loading accidents. Previously, rushing to load trucks had caused injuries when heavy items were dropped or improperly lifted. The compression module technique, because it required methodical placement of each item, reduced those accidents substantially. Truck maintenance improved as well. The more stable loads meant less strain on vehicle suspensions and frames. Breakdown rates decreased slightly. Trucks lasted longer between major overhauls. By December 1944, Hayes's method had saved an estimated 12,000 tons of supplies that would otherwise have been lost or damaged. Translated to tactical impact, that was enough ammunition for 2 infantry divisions for a week. Enough rations to feed an Army Corps for 3 days. Enough medical supplies for dozens of field hospitals. The success caught attention beyond comms. Other theater commands requested information about the compression module method. The technique was adopted by supply operations in Italy. Plans were made to implement it in the Pacific Theater. Hayes himself became a minor celebrity in logistics circles. He was interviewed for Stars and Stripes. His photograph appeared in Army Motors magazine with a feature article about his innovation. Senior officers visited Red Ball operations specifically to see compression module loading in person. But Hayes deflected the attention. "It's just practical trucking," he'd say. "Nothing I did was revolutionary. I just applied basic principles any experienced driver knows and adapted them to military conditions." That modesty was characteristic. Hayes never claimed to have invented anything entirely new. He'd synthesized existing knowledge, how cargo behaves during transport, how compression prevents shifting, how proper strapping distribution works, and applied it systematically to solve a specific problem. The true test of Hayes's method came in December 1944 during the Battle of the Bulge. On December 16th, German forces launched a massive surprise offensive through the Ardennes forest. The attack caught Allied forces off guard and created a crisis that threatened the entire Western Front. The German breakthrough created a bulge in Allied lines, hence the battle's name, and isolated American units that desperately needed resupply. The supply situation was catastrophic. The German offensive had cut Red Ball routes and disrupted the entire logistics network. Forward units were surrounded. Conventional supply lines were severed. Everything had to be rerouted through secondary roads under winter conditions. The weather was brutal. Snow, ice, and freezing temperatures. The worst winter in Europe in 50 years. Roads became ice-covered tracks. Visibility dropped to near zero during snowstorms. Trucks slipped and slid on frozen surfaces. Under these conditions, compression module loading proved its value in ways Hayes had never anticipated. The stable, tightly compressed loads handled winter roads better than anyone expected. Cargo that didn't shift provided ballast that improved traction. Trucks loaded using Hayes's method were significantly less likely to slide off icy roads than trucks with loose cargo that shifted laterally. More critically, the method's reduced loss rates became vital when every single round of ammunition and every ration box was desperately needed. Units surrounded at Bastogne and other positions couldn't afford 35% supply losses. They needed every ounce of what was shipped to them. Air supply drops supplemented ground transport, but aerial resupply was limited and weather-dependent. Most supplies still had to move by truck through German-contested territory on ice-covered mountain roads in blizzard conditions. Quartermaster truck companies performed heroically during this period. Drivers navigated roads under artillery fire. They drove through snowstorms with near-zero visibility. They transported supplies to surrounded units by whatever routes remained open, and they delivered those supplies intact. A particularly dramatic example occurred on December 22nd when a convoy of 30 trucks from the 398th Quartermaster Truck Company fought through to Bastogne, carrying desperately needed ammunition and medical supplies. The convoy had traveled for 18 hours through German-held territory under sporadic fire on ice-covered roads. Every truck was damaged. 2 drivers were wounded. But when they arrived and unloaded, 91% of the cargo was intact and usable. The commander of the 101st Airborne Division, surrounded at Bastogne, sent a personal commendation. The supplies arrived when they were needed most, and they arrived in usable condition. Similar stories played out across the Ardennes. Supply convoys running compression module loading delivered the ammunition, food, fuel, and medical supplies that kept surrounded units fighting until they could be relieved. After the German offensive was contained and then pushed back, logistics officers conducted an analysis of supply delivery during the battle. Despite the worst possible conditions, winter weather, combat conditions, disrupted routes, desperate urgency, the average delivery rate for convoys using compression module loading was 86%. Under the old standard loading methods in similar conditions, the expected delivery rate would have been 40% at best, probably closer to 30%. The difference was thousands of tons of supplies that reached soldiers who needed them. It's impossible to calculate exactly how much impact that had on the battle's outcome, but logistics officers universally agreed it was significant. Hayes himself spent the Battle of the Bulge at Calm's headquarters in Paris, coordinating supply rerouting and working with quartermaster companies to adapt compression module techniques to winter conditions. He developed supplemental procedures for loading in freezing weather, when strapping became stiff and hard to work with, when frozen cargo had different handling characteristics. By January 1945, as Allied forces pushed the Germans back and restored the front line, the supply crisis eased. The Red Ball Express continued operations through the winter and into spring, supporting the final drive into Germany. Throughout this period, compression module loading remained standard procedure. The method had proven itself under the worst possible conditions. There was no going back to the old way. *** Chapter 6, Legacy and Recognition *** The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. The Red Ball Express ceased operations in November 1944, when forward railways were restored enough to handle most supply traffic, but quartermaster truck companies continued to operate using compression module loading procedures. The final statistics were compiled in June 1945 as part of the Army's analysis of logistics operations during the European campaign. From November 1944 through May 1945, quartermaster truck companies using compression module loading transported approximately 380,000 tons of supplies across the European theater. The average delivery rate was 89% intact cargo. For comparison, during the period before compression module adoption, June through October 1944, similar companies transported approximately 260,000 tons with an average delivery rate of 63% intact cargo. The improvement represented approximately 90,000 tons of supplies delivered that would otherwise have been lost or damaged. That was more tonnage than had been landed on D-Day itself. Vernon Hayes received the Legion of Merit in July 1945 for his contribution to the war effort. The citation read, in part, "Warrant Officer Hayes developed innovative cargo loading procedures that dramatically improved supply delivery efficiency, directly contributing to the success of Allied operations in the European theater. He also received personal commendations from Lieutenant General Leah and from Lieutenant General Brehan Somerville, Commanding General of Army Service Forces. Both letters praised his practical innovation and its impact on combat operations. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from the soldiers who'd used the method. Drivers who'd seen their cargo arrive intact instead of shattered. Loaders who'd mastered the technique and took pride in their work. Supply officers who'd watched their delivery rates climb from catastrophic to excellent. The method outlived the war. After 1945, compression module loading became standard procedure in Army logistics manuals. The technique was taught at quartermaster schools. It was adapted for different types of cargo and different vehicle types. The basic principles, compression prevents shifting, proper weight distribution matters, attention to detail pays off, became foundational to military logistics. Civilian trucking companies adopted variations of the method after the war. Hayes's insights about cargo dynamics applied equally well to commercial transport. By the 1950s, most major freight companies used some form of compression-based load securing, though few knew where the technique had originated. Hayes himself returned to civilian life in August 1945. He went back to Baltimore and resumed his career as a long-haul trucker. He drove for another 22 years, retiring in 1967. He rarely talked about his wartime service. Friends and family knew he'd been in the Quartermaster Corps, but he didn't emphasize his role or his innovation. "I just loaded trucks," he'd say if asked. Did what made sense. In 1973, a military historian researching logistics innovations contacted Hayes for an interview. The resulting oral history, preserved at the Army Heritage and Education Center, provides the most detailed account of how he developed the compression module method. "I didn't invent anything," Hayes said in that interview. "I just paid attention. I watched what happened when cargo broke. I thought about why it broke. I tried different ways to prevent it. Some worked, some didn't. The ones that worked, I kept doing. That's not genius. That's just basic problem solving." When asked why he thought the military had been using ineffective loading procedures, Hayes was diplomatic. The standard methods worked fine for what they were designed for: short hauls, good roads, peacetime conditions. The problem was trying to use those methods for something they weren't designed for. Red Ball was a completely different situation. It needed different solutions. The interviewer asked if he was proud of what he'd accomplished. Hayes thought for a moment. "I'm proud that it helped," he said. "I'm proud that soldiers got the supplies they needed. I'm proud that drivers didn't have to watch half their cargo get destroyed after they'd worked so hard to deliver it. The recognition, the medals, that's nice, but it's not why I did it. I did it because the old way wasn't working and I thought I knew a better way." That pragmatic attitude characterized Hayes throughout his life. He saw a problem, analyzed it systematically, developed a solution, tested it rigorously, and implemented it effectively. The fact that his solution saved thousands of tons of supplies and contributed to Allied victory was, in his view, simply what happened when you applied practical thinking to practical problems. Vernon Hayes died in 1982, at age 72. His obituary in the Baltimore Sun mentioned his military service briefly, but focused mainly on his career as a trucker and his family. There was no mention of compression module loading or the Legion of Merit or his impact on military logistics. But at the Army Transportation School at Fort Eustis, Virginia, where Quartermaster and Transportation Corps officers learn their trade, there's a classroom named in his honor, the Hayes Loading Bay. The plaque on the wall reads, "Named for Warrant Officer Vernon Hayes, whose innovative thinking and practical expertise improved supply delivery and supported Allied victory in World War II." New officers learning modern loading procedures might wonder who Hayes was. If they ask, they'll hear the story. A trucker from Baltimore who saw a problem, developed a solution, and changed how the Army thought about logistics. Not through grand strategy or brilliant command, but through careful observation, systematic thinking, and the stubborn insistence that losses weren't inevitable if you were willing to load trucks differently. In the end, that might be the most important lesson. Wars are won by brilliant generals and brave soldiers, yes. But they're also won by technical sergeants and warrant officers who solve practical problems, by mechanics who improve equipment, by cooks who keep soldiers fed, by medics who save lives, by truckers who deliver supplies intact. Vernon Hayes was one of those unglamorous heroes. He didn't storm beaches or lead charges. He loaded trucks better than anyone else. And in doing so, he contributed as much to Allied victory as many who received far more recognition. The supplies that reached Bastogne in December 1944, arriving 91% intact after an 18-hour nightmare journey, that was Hayes's legacy. The ammunition that didn't break in transit, the medical supplies that arrived with intact vials, the rations that fed hungry soldiers. All of it delivered because one trucker refused to accept that a third of everything had to be lost. Stories like this deserve to be remembered. If you think so too, leave a comment and hit like for more untold stories from World War II. Subscribe to the channel for deep dives into the innovations, people, and moments that changed history but rarely made headlines. The math was simple. Load carefully, deliver intact, win the war. Vernon Hayes understood that. He proved it worked. And thousands of soldiers benefited from his stubborn insistence that there had to be a better way. Sometimes the most important innovations come from the most unexpected places, not from laboratories or planning rooms, but from the back of a truck in France where a Baltimore trucker spent 3 weeks figuring out how to keep cargo from breaking. That solution, refined and proven and adopted across an entire theater of war, saved tens of thousands of tons of supplies and supported the final drive into Germany. All because one man thought carefully about how boxes move when trucks hit potholes and then did something about it.